Welcome back. We're talking about the changing political direction in some Latin American countries. Joining us via Skype from Angra dos Reis, Brazil, is Rafael Salies. He's with Southern Pulse, a strategic advisory firm. And with us from Havana is Cuban journalist and commentator Cristina Escobar. Thank you to both of you for being with us. Cristina, the United States and Cuba have re-established diplomatic relations, and almost with every passing day, that relationship is normalized more and more. Do you think this is part of a broader trend by the United States to build stronger ties and more influence across Latin America?
Well, I think it's pragmatic from the interests of the U.S. vision to actually reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba, taking into consideration that the leadership of the U.S. in our hemisphere was damaged by the fact that trying to keep Cuba isolated when, after all, what it caused was the isolation of the U.S. So I think it's important to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba, and as a matter of fact, one of the reasons, the pressure that the government of the U.S. felt was actually the pressure of a consensus in Latin America to actually reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba. And of course, this could open a new path in Latin America for the U.S. In any case, it will remove an obstacle to actually start a different kind of relation with Latin America and essentially with Cuba.
Rafael, if we look at the political trends in Venezuela and Argentina, two major countries in Latin America, where there's been a shift away from left-wing parties, more to the center, will we see something similar in Brazil, do you think?
At the moment, it's a bit premature to talk about that since the next presidential elections are only in 2018. However, in 2016, we will likely be seeing a loss of municipalities by the current governing party, the Workers' Party, the PT. This will likely be brought upon by negative media from the Lava Jato scandal investigation, as well as a natural runoff of support after almost 16 years in power. They will be 16 years in power by 2018. So just time in seat, time administering the country tends to lead to a loss of support amongst the population. So while you can say that the PT will be losing power at the micro level in Brazil, it's still a little bit premature to say that the country will slide away from the left.
Cristina, if we look at what happened in Venezuela and Argentina, where people have changed their allegiance, they've changed their support from very progressive parties, moving more to the center. Do you think something like that could happen in Cuba?
It's not the same story, it's not the same circumstances, but I don't think so. The kind of platform that Cuba has for the future is very different from the one that exists in Venezuela and in Argentina, actually, and the kind of struggle between a strong, rich private sector that defends neoliberalism in those countries in front of leftist movements, more popular grassroots movements. That kind of situation which we had in the 50s doesn't exist anymore in Cuba in that same configuration. I think probably in Cuba we will see a more slow transition in this way, and we will see probably a horizontal debate about the future in Cuba in which more people will integrate the political scenario of Cuba, and probably we won't see this kind of scenario of that polarization. In Cuba, there's a great consensus around the conquest of the revolution process. And in that sense, even though Cubans want to see their quality lives improved and also the economic situation in general in the country change and improvements, in that sense, they also want to keep what we have in terms of social conquest, which is still a debt in a lot of countries of the world.
Rafael, let's look at something from The Economist newspaper. This is what The Economist wrote. It says, the left put inequality on the region's agenda and it is there to stay. But other issues are now equally pressing: a return to economic growth, clean government, and tackling violent crime. The center-right has a chance to return to power by capitalizing on the left's failings in these matters. Do you agree with that?
Partially. I think it's a bit dishonest to say that the left isn't really worried about tackling corruption. Taking Brazil as an example, the country's largest corruption scandal investigation leading to direct arrest of not only politicians but major business figures was done under the PT government. That said, it's not the direct cause of the PT government. It's not that the PT party went after corruption, but just that it allowed institutions to solidify and do what they were there to do.
Cristina, were there mistakes made by progressive governments, left-wing governments in Venezuela and Argentina that contributed to their demise? Or was it largely economic concerns, much of which they had no control over, things like the drop in commodity prices?
Well, of course, the commodity prices has been, the prices of the commodities in the international market has been a problem for these governments, because when you have an economy that is essentially linked to this kind of product, but of course it means that if you, for example, in the case of Venezuela, if your economy depends on oil, and suddenly oil was from $100 a barrel and now it's $35 a barrel, of course your government and the kind of performance that you do obviously will be affected, and that also has been an issue for Argentina, which also alerts us about the kind of model that in terms of economics that our countries wants to develop. Actually, Cuba has been changing that pattern in the recent years. As a matter of fact, the first income of Cuba is professional services abroad. Essentially, is the first income, then it's tourism, and much less every day that has to do with commodity. But of course, there's going to be a problem, and alerts the governments from Latin America that actually it's important to diversify this issue, to not only depend on commodities, even though always economy is a problem in every election. It's going to be into consideration in every election. I think now we also have a symptom of the emergency of the leftist, of the right-wing interest in our Latin American continent. But as a matter of fact, I think it's more of a reaction to some mistake that has been committed in the economics field, but also that has to do with the commodity prices. I think the future for left in Latin America, it has to do to talk more to the people, to actually go back to the grassroots from when they come from, because leftist government in Latin America is not something imposed, it's not something that's being exported, it's a consequence of the history of Latin America. Remember, the dictatorship process is backed by the US and backed by the right-wing movements in those countries, and these new governments that has been in place for around 10 years, 15 years in Latin America with a leftist perspective and social perspective are the consequence of those years. So I think there's a lot to talk about, much more than this. It's not that it's over, the leftist movements in Latin America. I think now there's an alert that some things need to be changed. But I think that we will be talking much more about this in the future.
Right, and if we look broadly at the political relationship between Cuba and Venezuela, these two countries, of course, are very close allies. As we see domestic politics changing in Venezuela, do you think that that relationship will endure?
That the relationship with Venezuela, between Venezuela and Cuba, is quite strong. But as a matter of fact, Cuba has learned a lot from the experiences of the past, of not having only one friend, and not depending in only one country, in only one commodity, and in only one political system and political stability. I think the experience of the Cuban government that has been proved, as a matter of fact, when you see the kind of diversification that the Cuban government is promoting in terms of commerce, in terms of political talking, even though not quitting from the principles of the traditional foreign affairs policy of the Cuban government, I think it's quite interesting and quite smart, because the experience of Cuba is when you end up with only one big friend, actually when that big friend doesn't exist anymore for different reasons, then you are in big trouble. So the idea is to diversify the kind of commerce. That's what the government of Cuba has said, is so try to build a model of socialism which is prosperous and sustainable in the future. And that has to do also with a process in which Cuba is every day more inserted in the globalization, and that also means that we have to be able to tackle the situations of different movements, political movements in the world, in the US, in Latin America. in order to be able to build our own political system, our own economic system, and being able to actually not just change or feel that much of impact when something like that changes. The alliance exists, is quite strong. There are 30,000 Cubans in Venezuela, but I don't think that the kind of impact that some media, international media, is saying about what will happen in Cuba, like when the Soviet Union fallen in the 90s, it's not like that. The kind of platform that Cuba has today is quite different. The kind of globalization and insertion in the international economy is quite different now. So I think that even though we're looking closer to what happens there, it's not going to be the kind of situation that we lived in the 90s.